Tonight, my sleepy listener, we sail through stormy shadows and time-worn gates into the heart of one of history's most dramatic final stands, the siege of Constantinople. The last flicker of Rome, surrounded by cannons, crusaders, and centuries of ambition. What really happened as the Great Walls crumbled? How did a city once thought untouchable fall in the quiet of dawn? And what was it like to be a scribe, a soldier, or simply someone trying to sleep through the fear? This is not a story of conquest. It's a lullaby of fading empires, echoing prayers, and moonlight over broken domes. Before we unroll the final chapter of Byzantium beneath the starlit silence, take a gentle moment to like, subscribe, and tap the bell icon to drift with us through more forgotten dreams of the past. In the comments below, tell us, would you rather defend the walls of Constantinople or vanish into the night before they fell? Your answer might shape the next sleepy tale we tell. The morning of April 6, 1453 began like any other in Constantinople, with the familiar sounds of merchants preparing their stalls and the clatter of cartwheels on cobblestones. But beneath this ordinary rhythm lay an extraordinary tension that had been building for weeks. You would have noticed it first in the bread lines, where the usual gossip about weather and harvests had given way to hushed calculations of how many loaves remained in the granaries, and how long they might last with the new mouths that kept arriving from the surrounding countryside. Emperor Constantine the Phalanx Palaiologos had ordered the city gates closed at sunset the previous evening, a decision that affected the daily routines of thousands. The fishermen who normally set out before dawn found their boats tethered securely, their nets piled unused on the docks. The morning bread distribution, which typically began when the cathedral bells rang for matins, had been moved earlier by 2 hours to accommodate the new soldiers who stood watch on walls that hadn't seen proper maintenance in decades. You could see them there now, these men from Genoa and Venice, rubbing sleep from their eyes as they gripped weapons they'd carried across the Mediterranean, wondering if they'd exchanged one form of uncertainty for another. The bread itself told a story of administrative precision that would bore most historians, but fascinated the clerks who recorded such things. Each loaf weighed exactly 8 ounces, a standard established by Emperor Justinian centuries earlier and maintained through countless political upheavals. The wheat for these loaves had been harvested from fields that now lay beyond the Ottoman lines, transported to the city during the previous autumn, when Constantine had anticipated this very situation. The grain had arrived in sacks marked with the imperial seal, each sack containing exactly 4 modi of wheat, enough to produce 64 loaves when ground by the watermills that still turned along the Golden Horn despite the looming threat. The bakers worked in all shifts that had been established through centuries of practice. The night shift, consisting of 12 master bakers and their assistants, began their work when the churches rang compline, mixing dough that would rise through the night hours. They worked by lamplight in the underground bakeries near the hippodrome, their movements practiced and efficient despite the darkness. By the time the morning star appeared, the first loaves were emerging from the ovens, their crusts cracking in the cool air that circulated through the ventilation shafts dug specifically for this purpose during the reign of Theophilus. The morning distribution required careful accounting. Each citizen presented a token stamped with their neighborhood designation and family size. These tokens, made from bronze discs exactly 1 inch in diameter, had been issued by the city prefect during the previous month, when it became clear that normal commerce would be disrupted. You would have watched as the distribution clerks, seated at wooden tables in the Forum of Constantine, recorded each transaction in ledgers that would later be copied for the imperial archives. The process was methodical to the point of tedium: name, token number, loaves issued, remaining balance. But behind this mundane bureaucracy lay calculations that would determine whether the city could withstand a siege. The imperial granaries contained approximately 127,000 modi of wheat, enough to provide bread for 50,000 people for roughly 4 months, if consumption remained at normal levels. However, the population had swelled with refugees from Thrace and Macedonia, increasing the daily bread requirement by nearly 30%. Additionally, the soldiers expected rations that exceeded civilian portions, creating a mathematical problem that occupied the emperor's advisors more than any military strategy. The water supply presented similar concerns that consumed hours of administrative attention. The aqueduct of Valens, completed in 368, still carried water from sources 12 miles away, but maintenance had been deferred due to lack of funds. The city prefect, a man named George, who had held his position for 11 years, spent his mornings walking the aqueduct line with engineers who could recite every crack and leak from memory. They carried measuring cords marked at precise intervals, using them to calculate the flow rate at various points along the channel. These measurements, recorded in wax tablets that would later be transcribed onto parchment, determined how water would be allocated during the coming siege. The cisterns presented another layer of mundane complexity. The largest, the basilica cistern, could hold 80,000 cubic feet of water, enough to supply the city for approximately 6 weeks if all other sources failed. But keeping this water pure required constant attention. Teams of workers descended the 52 stone steps each morning to remove debris and check the integrity of the 336 columns that supported the vaulted ceiling. They carried oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on the carved capitals, each one unique, bearing the marks of the craftsmen who had installed them 7 centuries earlier. The air down there was cool and damp, smelling of moss and minerals, a sensory experience that remained unchanged despite the political storms gathering above. As you walked through the city that morning, you would have noticed other details that seemed unworthy of historical record but would prove crucial in the coming weeks. The street cleaners still made their rounds, removing refuse that might attract rats and disease. The blacksmiths continued their work at forges near the Golden Horn, repairing tools and weapons with methods passed down through generations. The priests maintained their liturgical schedules, their chants, providing a rhythmic backdrop to daily life that would continue even when cannon fire replaced the sound of commerce. The walls themselves required daily attention that most citizens never considered. The Theodosian walls stretched for 14 miles, encompassing not just the city, but suburban areas that had grown up around the original defenses. Each tower along this perimeter needed inspection, with particular attention to the mortar joints that held the stone blocks together. You could have observed the wall wardens making their rounds, carrying small hammers that they used to test the integrity of the masonry. They listened for the particular sound that indicated loose stones, marking problem areas with chalk that would guide the repair crews who worked through the afternoon hours. These men knew their walls with an intimacy that surpassed romantic attachment. They could tell you which stones had been replaced during the reign of Heraclius, which sections had been damaged by earthquakes in 447 and 740, and which repairs had used limestone versus marble, depending on what materials were available during various reconstruction periods. This knowledge, accumulated over centuries of routine maintenance, represented a form of institutional memory that no invading army could possess. When Ottoman engineers eventually examined these same walls, they would find them remarkably sound, despite their age, a testament to the boring consistency of daily care. The harbour presented its own administrative challenges that morning. The great chain that could be stretched across the Golden Horn lay coiled on the northern shore, its iron links each weighing approximately 150 pounds. Installing this barrier required coordination between sailors, dock workers, and engineers who understood the tidal patterns and currents that affected the harbour. The chain itself had been forged in sections during the previous century, with each link inspected annually for signs of corrosion or weakness. You would have seen the harbour master, a Venetian named Marco, who had lived in Constantinople for 20 years, supervising the placement of wooden barges that would support the chain when it was deployed. Ships continued to arrive despite the growing tension, their captains making calculations about wind patterns and cargo values that seemed removed from the political drama unfolding on land. The Venetian merchant vessels carried spices from Alexandria and silk from Beirut, their holds packed according to loading plans that maximized profit while maintaining stability in rough seas. These merchants had developed routines for navigating the Dardanelles that involved timing their passages to avoid the strong currents that made progress difficult during certain lunar phases. They carried papers written in multiple languages, documenting cargo contents, crew manifests, and insurance arrangements that represented sophisticated commercial networks extending from London to Tabriz. As the sun climbed higher, casting shadows that revealed the precise angles of the city's layout, you would have observed the continuing rhythms of urban life that seemed oblivious to the threat gathering beyond the walls. The laundrywomen gathered at the public fountains, their conversation mixing gossip with practical concerns about soap quality and water temperature. The tile makers in the southern quarter continued production of ceramic squares that would decorate the floors of wealthy merchants, each piece painted with geometric patterns that required steady hands and patience developed over years of practice. The scribes in the imperial chancery copied documents using ink made from oak galls mixed with iron salts, creating records that would survive long after the political crises of their time had been forgotten. But even in these routine activities, you could detect subtle changes that indicated the city was preparing for extraordinary circumstances. The blacksmiths had shifted their production from agricultural implements to arrowheads and spear points, their forges burning later into the night as they worked through piles of iron that had been stockpiled during the winter months. The tanners had increased their output of leather, knowing that soldiers would need replacement for boots and armor straps that would wear out during extended duty on the walls. The carpenters had begun constructing additional mantlets, portable wooden screens that could protect archers during sorties beyond the walls, using techniques developed for building theatrical scenery but adapted for military purposes. These preparations proceeded with a slowness that frustrated those who understood the urgency of the situation. The Byzantine administrative system, developed over centuries to prevent hasty decisions that might destabilize the empire, now operated as a brake on rapid mobilization. Each purchase of military supplies required approval from multiple offices. Each payment needed verification by accountants who demanded documentation in triplicate, and each strategic decision involved consultation with advisors who had witnessed the failures of previous military adventures. This bureaucratic thoroughness, normally a source of stability, now created delays that would prove costly when time became the most precious commodity. As evening approached, the daily rhythms began their familiar transition. The bread distribution ended when the clerks calculated that exactly 12,147 loaves had been issued, leaving sufficient reserves for the following day, but indicating that consumption was running slightly ahead of projections. The wall wardens completed their rounds, submitting reports that recorded 17 locations requiring minor repairs, but no structural weaknesses that would concern the military engineers. The water department supervisors confirmed that flow rates remained within normal parameters, though they noted with concern that the level in the basilica cistern had dropped by 3 inches more than expected, suggesting either increased usage or a leak that would require investigation. The day concluded with the ceremonial closing of the gates, a process that now required military escorts for the guards who had performed this duty without incident for decades. You would have watched as they methodically secured each portal, counting the iron bars that reinforced the wooden doors and checking that the mechanisms for dropping the portcullises operated smoothly. This routine, performed thousands of times throughout the city's history, now carried a weight of significance that the participants couldn't fully articulate but intuitively understood. When the great bronze gates of the Golden Gate swung shut with their familiar groan of ancient hinges, They closed not just against the approaching night, but against a future that would demand more from these mundane preparations than anyone could yet imagine. As darkness settled over the city, the last sounds you would have heard were the familiar ones, the splash of oars from fishing boats that had been granted special permission to work through the night, the clink of pottery as families prepared their evening meals, the distant chanting from monasteries where prayers continued according to schedules established centuries earlier. These ordinary noises created an acoustic blanket of normalcy that temporarily masked the extraordinary nature of the moment. But beneath this familiar soundscape lurked questions that would define the coming weeks. Whether the careful calculations of bread weights and wall measurements would prove sufficient against an enemy who cared nothing for Byzantine administrative precision. Whether the mundane routines that had sustained the empire for 1,000 years could withstand the revolutionary changes that approached with the morning light. The city slept, but its sleep was uneasy, filled with dreams that mixed familiar landscapes with unfamiliar threats. In the darkness, you could almost hear the collective mind of Constantinople working through the arithmetic of survival, counting loaves and measuring distances, calculating how long the ordinary could resist the extraordinary forces that gathered beyond walls that had never been designed to withstand the kind of assault that modern warfare would bring. The answers to these calculations would emerge in the coming days, but for now the city maintained its ancient rhythms, finding comfort in the boring precision of daily life that had carried it through previous crises and might, if fortune favored the meticulous over the mighty, carry it through this one as well. What the city couldn't yet know was that these mundane preparations, the precise bread weights, the careful wall measurements, the systematic allocation of water and other resources represented a form of resistance that would prove more meaningful than any battlefield heroics. They embodied the accumulated wisdom of centuries, the understanding that survival often depended less on dramatic gestures than on the patient accumulation of small advantages, the boring attention to detail that separated those who endured from those who merely resisted. Whether this philosophy would prove adequate against the revolutionary changes that approached remained an open question, one that would be answered not through military strategy, but through the quiet persistence of ordinary people maintaining extraordinary standards in the face of unprecedented challenges. The night deepened, and with it came the realization that the city's fate might rest not on the courage of its soldiers or the wisdom of its emperors, but on the accuracy of its clerks and the reliability of its bakers, on mundane calculations that seemed too boring for history, but too important for survival. This was the paradox that Constantinople faced as April 6, 1453, drew to a close, that the extraordinary events approaching would be met not by extraordinary preparations, but by the same boring thoroughness that had sustained the empire through countless previous challenges, a strategy that had always worked before, but might prove inadequate against enemies who had learned to weaponize change itself. The morning of April 20th, 1453, brought with it the kind of arithmetic that determines the fate of empires. You would have found the imperial accountants gathered in the Bureau of Provisions, their faces illuminated by oil lamps as they worked through calculations that would have bored most soldiers, but represented the difference between victory and starvation. The previous day's bread distribution had consumed 14,320 loaves, an increase of 1,473 from the day before, and this seemingly minor escalation triggered a cascade of mathematical adjustments that would occupy the administration for hours. The grain merchants who had remained in the city worked from offices near the Golden Horn, their ledgers recording transactions that lacked the drama of military preparations but would prove equally decisive. Each sack of wheat contained exactly 4 modii, and each modius could produce 16 loaves when milled properly. But the milling process itself required careful attention to details that seemed almost absurdly mundane. The water wheels needed to turn at precisely the right speed to avoid crushing the bran too finely. The millstones required daily dressing with iron picks to maintain their grinding surfaces, and the resulting flour had to be sifted through screens with exactly 64 meshes per square inch to achieve the proper consistency for bread making. You could have observed the flour merchants testing their product using methods established during the reign of Constantine VII. They took small samples between their fingers, feeling for the slight grit that indicated proper grinding, and smelled for the musty odor that suggested storage problems. Good flour, they knew, should have the faint sweetness of fresh grain with no hint of sourness that might indicate fermentation. They recorded these observations in small notebooks carried in leather pouches, accumulating data that would determine which suppliers received the limited coins available for purchasing additional grain reserves. The bakers themselves operated according to routines that had changed little since ancient times. Their work began when the church of Hagia Sophia rang the first bell of the night watch, summoning them from their beds to confront dough that had been started the previous afternoon. The leavening process required exactly 12 hours during cool spring weather, longer when temperatures dropped and shorter during summer heat. Each baker maintained his own starter culture, feeding it daily with flour and water, keeping it alive like a domestic animal that demanded regular attention. These cultures represented decades of careful cultivation, some dating back generations, and their maintenance required the kind of patience that seemed increasingly rare in a world threatened by cannon fire. The ovens themselves presented engineering challenges that consumed hours of attention. Constructed from bricks made from local clay mixed with straw, they needed to reach temperatures of approximately 450 degrees Fahrenheit to bake bread properly. Achieving this temperature required precise management of the wood fire that heated the oven floor. Too little fuel produced insufficient heat and resulted in pale, doughy loaves. Too much created excessive temperatures that burned the crust before the interior cooked through. The bakers judged these conditions by experience, placing their hands near the oven opening to feel for the proper intensity of heat, a skill that couldn't be taught quickly to assistants pressed into service during emergencies. Water for the bread-making process came from sources that required their own forms of mundane maintenance. The public fountains throughout the city delivered water through lead pipes that had been installed during various imperial building programs over the centuries. These pipes required regular inspection for leaks, and the fountain attendants kept records of flow rates that would have seemed impossibly tedious to anyone except those who understood that small changes in water pressure could indicate larger problems in the distribution system. A drop of 2 ounces per minute in a fountain's output might seem insignificant, but it could signal a breach in the main aqueduct that would require immediate attention to prevent more serious failures. The distribution of bread itself had evolved into a process that combined ancient tradition with bureaucratic innovation. Each citizen's entitlement had been established during the reign of Constantine the Great, based on categories that seemed almost comically specific. Adult males received 1 full loaf daily. Adult females received 3/4 of a loaf. Children received half loaves until they reached the age of 14, and elderly residents over 60 received the same portions as children. These distinctions required record keepers to maintain detailed census information, including birth dates that had to be verified through church baptismal records when disputes arose. The actual weighing of bread occurred using bronze scales that had been manufactured in workshops near the hippodrome. These instruments required calibration using standard weights that were themselves subject to verification by the city's metronomoi, the officials responsible for maintaining measurement standards throughout the empire. The weights themselves represented a form of technological expertise that seemed almost mystical in its precision. Cast from bronze using molds that had been passed down through generations of metal workers, they incorporated small adjustments for temperature variations that could affect measurement accuracy. A weight that was perfectly accurate at 60 degrees Fahrenheit might be slightly off at 80 degrees, requiring corrections that the metronomoi had memorized through years of experience. The packaging and transportation of bread-involved considerations that would have seemed absurdly detailed to anyone not familiar with the logistical challenges of feeding a city under siege. Each loaf needed to cool for exactly 30 minutes after baking to prevent the accumulation of moisture that could lead to mold growth. They were then stacked in wicker baskets that held exactly 12 loaves each, a quantity that balanced efficient transportation with the risk of crushing the bottom layers. These baskets were carried by porters who had developed techniques for balancing loads that could weigh up to 40 pounds while navigating the uneven cobblestones that characterized most city streets. The accounting for all these activities required paperwork that would have overwhelmed a less organized administration. Daily reports tracked everything from the number of loaves produced to the amount of firewood consumed in the baking process. These documents were copied and distributed to multiple offices, creating a paper trail that allowed officials to identify trends and problems before they became critical. A sudden increase in firewood consumption might indicate that ovens were being operated inefficiently, while a decrease in bread production could signal problems with grain supply or baker illness that required immediate attention. The walls that protected all this activity required their own forms of mathematical attention. The Theodosian walls stretched for approximately 14 miles, encompassing an area that included not just the city proper, but suburban settlements that had grown up around the original defenses. Each tower along this perimeter needed to be staffed according to calculations that balanced defensive needs with the limited number of available soldiers. The standard allocation called for 4 men per tower, but this number had been reduced to 2 in many locations due to manpower shortages, requiring those remaining to cover twice the normal patrol area. The maintenance of these defenses involved measurements that seemed almost obsessively precise. The walls themselves varied in height from 40 to 60 feet depending on the terrain, with the highest sections typically located on ridges that provided natural defensive advantages. The masonry construction incorporated limestone blocks that averaged 2 feet in height and 4 feet in width, though variations existed depending on the quarry sources used during different reconstruction periods. The mortar joints between these blocks needed to maintain a consistent width of approximately 1/4 inch to ensure structural stability, requiring masons to carry specialized tools for measuring and adjusting these gaps. The gates themselves represented engineering achievements that required understanding of principles that seemed almost modern in their complexity. The Golden Gate, constructed during the reign of Theodosius II, incorporated a system of counterweights that allowed the massive bronze doors to be opened by just 4 men, despite weighing several tons each. This mechanism required regular maintenance using olive oil that had to be of a particular grade. Too thick, and it would gum up the works. Too thin, and it would drain away without providing adequate lubrication. The gatekeepers maintained records of oil usage that allowed them to predict when the system would require attention, preventing failures that could leave the gates impossible to open or close. As April progressed toward its inevitable conclusion, these mundane calculations took on increasing urgency. The bread distribution required daily adjustments based on consumption patterns that shifted as the population's anxiety levels rose. People began hoarding small quantities, creating fluctuations in demand that disrupted the carefully balanced system. The bakers responded by producing slightly smaller loaves, a change of just 1 ounce per loaf that saved enough flour to extend reserves by several days, but required new calculations for every aspect of the operation, from mixing times to baking temperatures. The water distribution faced similar challenges as people began washing more frequently, either for hygiene during increased manual labor or for ritual purification as religious observances intensified. This additional consumption, measured in ounces per person per day, accumulated into significant increases that put pressure on the entire system. The cistern attendants noted these changes in their daily reports, calculating that at current usage rates, the stored water would last approximately 6 weeks rather than the 8 weeks originally projected. These arithmetic problems occupied the minds of administrators, who understood that the city's survival might depend not on military heroics, but on the accuracy of their calculations. They worked through the night, their oil lamps casting shadows on parchment, covered with numbers that seemed impossibly trivial given the stakes involved. But they also understood something that would become clear only in retrospect, that the accumulation of small advantages, the patient attention to boring details, represented a form of resistance that was uniquely Byzantine in its approach to survival. Whether this approach would prove adequate against the revolutionary changes that approached remained uncertain, but it represented the only strategy available to those who had learned through centuries of experience that empires often fell not through dramatic defeats, but through the gradual accumulation of minor miscalculations. The night deepened, and with it came the realization that the arithmetic of survival had become impossibly complex. Every calculation affected dozens of others, creating a web of interdependencies that could be disrupted by factors ranging from weather changes to the mood swings of anxious populations. But in this complexity lay also a form of hope that the same meticulous attention to detail that had sustained the empire for 1,000 years might yet find solutions to problems that seemed insurmountable when viewed through the lens of conventional military strategy. The clerks continued their work, their pens scratching across parchment as they added and subtracted, multiplied and divided their way through the boring mathematics that would determine whether the Queen of Cities could maintain her ancient glory against enemies who had learned to weaponize change itself. The morning of May 28, 1453, arrived with the kind of calculations that determine whether civilizations endure or collapse. You would have found the imperial accountants working by candlelight in the basement of the Palace of Blakeney, their faces illuminated by flickering flames as they confronted numbers that had become impossibly stark. The previous day's bread distribution had consumed 18,047 loaves, an increase of more than 4,000 from the sieges beginning, and this dramatic escalation represented not just increased consumption, but the terrifying reality that the end was approaching with mathematical precision. The grain reserves, and that had seemed adequate when the siege began now, existed only in theoretical calculations. The imperial granaries contained exactly 12,147 modi of wheat, enough to provide bread for perhaps 10 days if consumption continued at current rates. But these calculations assumed normal distribution patterns, and the chaos of the final assault would render such orderly administration impossible. The clerks who recorded these figures understood that they were documenting not just resource depletion, but the approaching end of a system that had functioned for over 1,000 years with boring regularity. The bakers who had maintained their ancient routines through 53 days of siege now worked under conditions that would have seemed impossible when the siege began. Their supplies of fuel had been exhausted days earlier, requiring them to burn furniture, books, and eventually structural timbers from abandoned buildings to maintain oven temperatures. The temperature control that had been developed through centuries of experience became irrelevant when fuel quality varied so dramatically. You could have watched as they attempted to judge proper heat levels by the color of flames consuming mahogany tables and silk-covered manuscripts, improvising techniques for achieving the temperatures necessary to transform their remaining flour into edible bread. The water situation had reached a point where calculations became meaningless. The cisterns that had sustained the city through previous sieges were nearly empty, their water levels dropping below the intake ports that fed the distribution system. Workers had been lowered on ropes to scoop the remaining water from collection pools that had been designed with the assumption that replenishment would occur through normal rainfall and aqueduct flow. The measurements that had occupied so much administrative attention now registered not gradual depletion, but the approach of absolute exhaustion, with water levels measured in inches rather than feet. The walls that had been maintained with such meticulous attention for centuries now existed in a state that defied the careful measurements that had guided their construction and maintenance. The Ottoman bombardment had created breaches that violated every principle of defensive architecture that the Byzantine engineers understood. You could have observed the repair crews as they attempted to fill these gaps using materials that would have been considered inadequate for even temporary construction under normal circumstances. They stacked broken furniture, torn clothing, and even books from monastic libraries to create barriers that they understood would provide only the illusion defense against determined attackers. The distribution system that had been the pride of Byzantine administration collapsed not through any single dramatic failure, but through the accumulation of minor disruptions that rendered the entire enterprise impossible. The bronze scales used for weighing bread had been damaged by debris from nearby explosions, their precise measurements rendered meaningless when supplies no longer existed to be measured. The standard weights that had been verified by generations of metronomoi were abandoned when survival depended not on accurate measurements but on the chaotic allocation of whatever resources could be found. The bookkeeping that had documented every aspect of the city's operation for centuries simply stopped when the clerks who maintained these records were called to military duty or fled to protect their families. The ledgers that had contained precise calculations of grain consumption, water usage, and resource allocation were left open on desks, their final entries recording figures that represented not ongoing operations, but the terminal points of systems that would never function again. You could have examined these documents and found the last entries made in steady hands that recorded the approach of inevitable failure, with the same methodical attention that had characterized Byzantine administration at its height. The ordinary citizens who had depended on these systems for their daily survival now faced circumstances that rendered their traditional knowledge irrelevant. The women who had managed household economies based on predictable bread allocations found themselves improvising strategies for stretching dwindling supplies that would have seemed absurdly inadequate under normal conditions. They mixed sawdust with flour to extend their meager reserves, creating loaves that provided bulk without nutrition but might temporarily quiet the hunger of children who couldn't understand why the familiar distribution system had ceased to function. The soldiers who defended the walls faced similar breakdowns in the support systems that had sustained them through weeks of siege. Their daily rations, calculated according to rank and duty assignment, had been reduced to random allocations of whatever food could be scavenged from abandoned buildings or taken from civilians who could no longer claim protection from imperial authority. The standard measurements that had governed military supply for centuries became meaningless when distribution depended on immediate availability rather than bureaucratic procedures that presupposed adequate reserves. The religious institutions that had provided both spiritual and practical support to the population found their traditional roles transformed by circumstances that violated their understanding of proper order. The monasteries that had maintained bakeries for the poor exhausted their supplies and began breaking apart their own structures to provide fuel for the community ovens that served refugees who had taken shelter within their walls. You could have watched as monks, who had spent decades copying manuscripts, fed the products of their scholarly labors into fires that would bake bread for people they knew only as fellow sufferers. In the final days of a civilization, the commercial districts that had been the heart of Constantinople's economy through centuries of transformation became scenes of desperate improvisation as merchants attempted to convert their remaining goods into forms that might prove useful during the final assault. Silk merchants traded their valuable fabrics for simple weapons, knowing that their survival might depend on possessing a sharp blade rather than possessing wealth that would become meaningless if the city fell. The precise measurements that had governed trade, lengths of cloth measured in ells, weights of spices measured in ounces, values calculated in hyperpyra, became irrelevant when exchange depended on immediate utility rather than established market relationships. The bakers who had maintained their ancient routines through 53 days of siege now worked under conditions that would have seemed impossible when the siege began. Their supplies of fuel had been exhausted days earlier, requiring them to burn furniture, books, and eventually structural timbers from abandoned buildings to maintain oven temperatures. The temperature control that had been developed through centuries of experience became irrelevant when fuel quality varied so dramatically. You could have watched as they attempted to judge proper heat levels by the color of flames consuming mahogany tables and silk-covered manuscripts, improvising techniques for achieving the temperatures necessary to transform their remaining flour into edible bread. The water situation had reached a point where calculations became meaningless. The cisterns that had sustained the city through previous sieges were nearly empty, their water levels dropping below the intake ports that fed the distribution system. Workers had been lowered on ropes to scoop the remaining water from collection pools that had been designed with the assumption that replenishment would occur through normal rainfall and aqueduct flow. The measurements that had occupied so much administrative attention now registered not gradual depletion, but the approach of absolute exhaustion, with water levels measured in inches rather than feet. The walls that had been maintained with such meticulous attention for centuries now existed in a state that defied the careful measurements that had guided their construction and maintenance. The Ottoman bombardment had created breaches that violated every principle of defensive architecture that the Byzantine engineers understood. You could have observed the repair crews as they attempted to fill these gaps using materials that would have been considered inadequate for even temporary construction under normal circumstances. They stacked broken furniture, torn clothing, and even books from monastic libraries to create barriers that they understood would provide only the illusion defense against determined attackers. The distribution system that had been the pride of Byzantine administration collapsed not through any single dramatic failure, but through the accumulation of minor disruptions that rendered the entire enterprise impossible. The bronze scales used for weighing bread had been damaged by debris from nearby explosions, their precise measurements rendered meaningless when supplies no longer existed to be measured. The standard weights that had been verified by generations of metronomoi were abandoned when survival depended not on accurate measurements but on the chaotic allocation of whatever resources could be found. The bookkeeping that had documented every aspect of the city's operation for centuries simply stopped when the clerks who maintained these records were called to military duty or fled to protect their families. The ledgers that had contained precise calculations of grain consumption, water usage, and resource allocation were left open on desks, their final entries recording figures that represented not ongoing operations, but the terminal points of systems that would never function again. You could have examined these documents and found the last entries made in steady hands that recorded the approach of inevitable failure. With the same methodical attention that had characterized Byzantine administration at its height, the ordinary citizens who had depended on these systems for their daily survival now faced circumstances that rendered their traditional knowledge irrelevant. The women who had managed household economies based on predictable bread allocations found themselves improvising strategies for stretching dwindling supplies that would have seemed absurdly inadequate under normal conditions. They mixed sawdust with flour to extend their meager reserves, creating loaves that provided bulk without nutrition but might temporarily quiet the hunger of children who couldn't understand why the familiar distribution system had ceased to function. The soldiers who defended the walls faced similar breakdowns in the support systems that had sustained them through weeks of siege. Their daily rations, calculated according to rank and duty assignment, had been reduced to random allocations of whatever food could be scavenged from abandoned buildings or taken from civilians who could no longer claim protection from imperial authority. The standard measurements that had governed military supply for centuries became meaningless when distribution depended on immediate availability rather than bureaucratic procedures that presupposed adequate reserves. The religious institutions that had provided both spiritual and practical support to the population found their traditional roles transformed by circumstances. that violated their understanding of proper order. The monasteries that had maintained bakeries for the poor exhausted their supplies and began breaking apart their own structures to provide fuel for the community ovens that served refugees who had taken shelter within their walls. You could have watched as monks, who had spent decades copying manuscripts, fed the products of their scholarly labors into fires that would bake bread for people they knew only as fellow sufferers in the final days of a civilization. The commercial districts that had been the heart of Constantinople's economy through centuries of transformation became scenes of desperate improvisation as merchants attempted to convert their remaining goods into forms that might prove useful during the final assault. Silk merchants traded their valuable fabrics for simple weapons, knowing that their survival might depend on possessing a sharp blade rather than possessing wealth that would become meaningless if the city fell. The precise measurements that had governed trade, lengths of cloth measured in ells, weights of spices measured in ounces, values calculated in hyperpyra, became irrelevant when exchange depended on immediate utility rather than established market relationships. The international merchants who had maintained permanent establishments in the city found themselves confronting calculations that violated every principle of commercial operations they had learned through decades of trade. The Venetians, who had managed their quarter according to agreements that specified precise rights and responsibilities, now found themselves improvising defensive strategies that their commercial expertise had never required. The Genoese, who had controlled access to the Black Sea through their establishments in Galata, faced the collapse of trading relationships that had sustained their community for generations, realizing that their expertise in calculating profit margins provided no guidance for calculating survival probabilities. As the final day progressed toward its inevitable conclusion, the mathematical certainties that had governed Byzantine administration for centuries gave way to calculations that were both simpler and more terrifying. The question was no longer how long reserves might last under various consumption scenarios, but whether any reserves remained at all. The question was no longer how to maintain the precise measurements that had characterized imperial operations, but whether such precision had any remaining relevance when survival depended on immediate responses to changing circumstances. The final entries in the administrative records, made by clerks who understood they were documenting the end of their civilization, contained figures that represented not ongoing operations but terminal points in systems that had functioned with boring reliability for longer than any contemporary memory. These final calculations recorded bread consumption that exceeded remaining supplies by impossible margins, water usage that had depleted reserves beyond recovery, and wall damage that violated every principle of defensive construction that Byzantine engineers understood. They represented the mathematical confirmation of what everyone in the city already understood, that the arithmetic of survival had reached its final sum, and the result was zero. But in these final calculations lay also a form of historical truth that would escape the notice of chroniclers who focused on military heroics and political drama. They documented the boring reality that civilizations don't typically collapse through spectacular failures, but through the gradual exhaustion of the systems that sustain ordinary life. They recorded the precise moment when administrative competence became irrelevant in the face of mathematical impossibility, when the patient accumulation of small advantages that had characterized Byzantine survival strategies for a millennium encountered problems that could not be solved. Through better organization or more careful attention to detail, the night brought the final realization that the calculations which had occupied so much administrative attention throughout the siege had been correct in their fundamental assumptions, but inadequate in their understanding of what happens when complex systems approach their terminal points. The Byzantine approach to survival had always depended on maintaining sufficient reserves to bridge periods of crisis, on the understanding that patience and careful management could overcome temporary setbacks. What they encountered in May 1453 was not a temporary setback, but the end of the historical conditions that had made their approach to governance possible. As Constantinople fell, it did so not because of military incompetence or political betrayal, but because the boring mathematics that had sustained it for centuries finally encountered problems that could not be solved through more careful calculation. The bread weights that had been established through centuries of experience became meaningless when no bread remained to be weighed. The wall measurements that had guided construction and maintenance for a millennium became irrelevant when bombardment created breaches that violated every principle of defensive architecture. The water calculations that had sustained urban life became academic when cisterns ran dry and aqueducts lay broken. The final lesson of these calculations was both simple and profound, that civilizations endure through the patient attention to boring details that seem too trivial for history, but prove essential for survival, and that they collapse when these details can no longer be sustained, regardless of how carefully they have been managed. The Byzantine Empire fell not because it had forgotten how to calculate, but because the conditions that had made calculation relevant had ceased to exist, leaving behind only the records of administrators who had documented the approach of their own extinction with the same methodical precision that had characterized their service throughout their careers. The chain that would determine Constantinople's fate arrived in sections, each link forged by blacksmiths who understood they were creating not just a barrier, but a mathematical statement about what was possible when ancient engineering met modern warfare. You could have observed its construction in the foundries of Galata, where Genoese craftsmen worked according to specifications that seemed almost absurd in their precision. Each iron link measured exactly 18 inches in length and weighed 143 pounds, dimensions determined through calculations that accounted for the stress loads that would be imposed when the entire assembly stretched. Across the Golden Horn's unpredictable currents, the metallurgy involved in creating these links represented technological knowledge that had been refined over centuries of maritime experience. The iron itself came from mines in Anatolia, smelted in furnaces that operated at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit to remove impurities that could create weak points under stress. The carbon content had to be maintained at precisely 0.3% to achieve the optimal balance between strength and flexibility, a requirement that meant each batch of ore needed to be tested using methods that seemed almost alchemical to observers unfamiliar with metallurgical science. Samples were drawn from every furnace load, cooled and examined for crystalline structure that would indicate whether the metal possessed the properties necessary for maritime applications. The forging process required timing that seemed impossibly precise to those unfamiliar with industrial production, methods that predated modern machinery. Each link needed to be worked while the metal maintained a temperature between 1200 and 1400 degrees Fahrenheit, a range that provided sufficient malleability for shaping while preventing the crystalline structure from becoming too coarse. The blacksmiths who performed this work had learned their trade through apprenticeships that began in childhood, developing the ability to judge temperature by the color of hot metal, a skill that allowed them to identify the exact moment when iron glowed with the orange-yellow hue that indicated optimal working. Temperature, the assembly of individual links into the complete chain, required techniques that combine traditional craftsmanship with innovative solutions to problems that had never been encountered before. The connection points between links needed to maintain flexibility while providing strength that could resist the tons of force that would be generated when the chain was deployed across the harbor. This requirement led to the development of connection methods that seemed almost unnecessarily complex. Each link incorporated a socket joint that allowed for movement in multiple directions while maintaining structural integrity under load conditions that could shift dramatically based on tidal changes and wind patterns. The testing procedures for completed chain sections revealed the same attention to boring details that characterized every aspect of Byzantine engineering projects. Individual links were subjected to stress tests using weights that simulated the loads they would encounter during actual deployment. These tests required the construction of specialized apparatus that could apply measured forces while allowing engineers to observe how the metal responded to various stress conditions. The pass-fail criteria seemed almost comically specific. A link was considered acceptable if it could sustain a load of 5,000 pounds for a minimum of 30 minutes without showing deformation exceeding 1/16 of an inch, measurements that required instruments capable of detecting changes. Invisible to the naked eye, the transportation of chain sections from the foundries to their deployment positions required logistical planning that seemed unnecessarily elaborate until you understood the consequences of failure. Each section weighed approximately 2 tons, requiring teams of 8 oxen to move them through streets that had been designed for pedestrian traffic and light carts. The route had to be surveyed in advance to identify potential obstacles, including sections where the weight might exceed the load-bearing capacity of wooden bridges or cobblestone surfaces. Engineers walked these routes carrying measuring devices that could determine whether the infrastructure could support the concentrated loads imposed by the massive chain segments. The timing of transportation required coordination with tidal patterns that affected water levels in the Golden Horn and could influence the ease of final installation. The chain needed to be deployed during conditions that allowed for precise positioning while providing sufficient water depth for the operation. This requirement meant that installation teams had to work within windows that sometimes lasted only a few hours, requiring rehearsal of procedures that seemed almost comically complex when viewed out of context. Crews practiced connecting chain sections using techniques developed specifically for this project, working in conditions that simulated the tidal currents and wind patterns they would encounter during actual deployment. The engineering calculations that determined the chain specifications involved mathematical concepts that would have seemed impossibly advanced to anyone not familiar with Byzantine engineering traditions. The total length required precise determination based on measurements of the harbor's width at various tidal conditions, with additional length needed to accommodate the sag that would occur when the chain's weight was supported only at its ends. This calculation required understanding of catenary curves, a mathematical concept that describes how chains and cables hang under their own weight when supported only at their ends, a phenomenon that had been observed empirically for centuries, but was only beginning to be described mathematically during this period. The anchoring systems that would secure the chain represented engineering challenges that required solutions seemingly more appropriate for permanent bridge construction than temporary defensive measures. The anchor points needed to withstand forces that could exceed 50 tons when tidal currents combined with wind pressure to create maximum stress conditions. This requirement led to the development of anchoring methods that incorporated techniques from both maritime and civil engineering, including the use of massive stone blocks that had been quarried specifically for this purpose and transported to the installation sites using methods that seemed almost ridiculously elaborate for what was essentially a defensive improvisation. The coordination of all these elements required administrative procedures that epitomized the Byzantine approach to complex projects. Every aspect of the operation was documented in triplicate, with copies maintained by the imperial engineers, the Genoese contractors who manufactured the chain, and the naval officials who would oversee its deployment. These documents included specifications that seem almost obsessively detailed, the exact composition of the iron alloy used in each link, the temperature ranges maintained during forging, the stress test results for every individual section, and the transportation routes used for each segment. This documentation served purposes that extended beyond immediate project management, creating records that could guide future repairs or modifications as conditions changed during the siege. As the installation date approached, the final preparations revealed the same attention to procedural details that had characterized every phase of the project. The crews who would handle the chain underwent training that included practice with equipment specifically designed for this operation. including massive windlasses that could apply controlled tension to the chain during deployment and specialized hooks that could connect sections underwater, without requiring divers to work in dangerous conditions. These tools represented technological innovations developed specifically for this project, incorporating solutions to problems that had never been encountered in previous defensive operations. The weather conditions required continuous monitoring to identify optimal installation windows, leading to the establishment of observation procedures that seem almost comically thorough in their attention to meteorological details. Teams recorded wind speed and direction at hourly intervals, measured water temperature and clarity, and tracked cloud formations that might indicate approaching storms. This information was compiled into reports that guided the final decision about when to attempt deployment, creating a bureaucratic infrastructure that seemed disproportionate to what was essentially a straightforward engineering operation. But in these procedures lay also the recognition that this chain represented more than a simple defensive measure. It embodied the Byzantine approach to survival through the patient accumulation of small advantages, the understanding that complex problems could be solved through systematic attention to details that seemed too boring for conventional military strategy. Whether this philosophy would prove adequate against the revolutionary changes that approached remained uncertain, but it represented the only strategy available to those who had learned through centuries of experience that impossibility could sometimes be overcome through impossibly thorough preparation. The chain that would soon stretch across the Golden Horn represented a form of resistance that was uniquely Byzantine in its approach to seemingly impossible challenges. It embodied the belief that mathematics and engineering could accomplish what military superiority could not, that patient calculation could sometimes overcome overwhelming force, and that the boring attention to detail that had sustained the empire for 1,000 years might yet find solutions to problems that seemed insurmountable when viewed through conventional strategic thinking. Whether this belief would prove justified would become clear only when the chain faced its ultimate test against enemies who had learned to weaponize change itself. The morning of April 20, 1453, brought with it meteorological conditions that seemed almost designed for the deployment of the Great Chain across the Golden Horn. You would have observed the harbour master, Marco of Venice, checking his weather instruments with the methodical attention of man who understood that this operation could not be repeated if initial attempts failed. The wind speed registered at exactly 6 knots from the northeast, creating conditions that would allow for precise positioning while providing sufficient water movement to prevent the chain from becoming entangled during deployment. The barometric pressure stood at 30.12 inches of mercury, a reading that suggested stable conditions for at least the next 12 hours based on observation, records that stretched back through decades of maritime experience. The crews who would handle the chain had been assembled according to schedules that seemed almost obsessively detailed in their attention to personnel allocation. Each team consisted of 12 men who had undergone training that included practice with the specific tools and techniques required for this operation. They wore clothing that had been selected for its ability to provide warmth without restricting movement, garments that incorporated multiple layers of wool and cotton in combinations that offered protection against both the cool spring air and the spray that would be generated when the chain entered the water. Their boots were equipped with leather soles that had been treated with fish oil to provide traction on the wet surfaces they would encounter during installation. The vessels that would support the deployment had been selected according to specifications that seemed unnecessarily elaborate until you understood the consequences of failure. The primary ship, a Genoese merchant vessel named Madonna della Grazia, measured exactly 127 feet in length and carried a displacement of 850 tons, dimensions that provided the stability necessary for handling the massive weight of chain sections while maintaining maneuverability in the confined waters of the Golden Horn. The crew of this vessel had been briefed on procedures that included detailed instructions for responding to various failure scenarios, contingencies that seemed almost pessimistically comprehensive but reflected the understanding that this operation represented Constantinople's primary defense against naval attack. The engineering calculations that guided the deployment required mathematical precision that would have seemed impossibly complex to observers unfamiliar with Byzantine engineering traditions. The chain needed to be positioned at a depth that would allow it to remain submerged during normal tidal conditions, while preventing Ottoman vessels from passing over it, even at maximum tide levels. This requirement meant establishing a deployment depth of approximately 15 feet below mean water level, a measurement that varied by nearly 3 feet depending on tidal conditions and required constant adjustment throughout the installation process. The connection points that would secure the chain to the harbour walls represented construction projects that had required weeks of preliminary work. The northern anchor point, located near the Genoese settlement of Pera, incorporated a stone block that measured 12 feet on each side and weighed approximately 200 tons, a mass that had been quarried specifically for this purpose and transported using methods that seemed almost ridiculously elaborate. The block incorporated iron fittings that had been forged according to specifications that allowed for connection to chain sections while providing the flexibility necessary to accommodate movement caused by tidal forces and thermal expansion as temperatures changed throughout the day. The southern anchor point presented different challenges that required innovative solutions seemingly more appropriate for permanent bridge construction than temporary defensive measures. The existing seawall at this location had been constructed during the reign of Theodosius the King and incorporated masonry techniques that made modification difficult without risking structural damage to the entire defensive system. Engineers developed a method for anchoring the chain that distributed loads across multiple points on the wall surface, using iron plates that spread stress across areas large enough to prevent crushing of the limestone blocks that comprised the wall's construction. The deployment procedure itself required coordination between teams that seemed almost comically elaborate, given the straightforward nature of the task. The harbour master maintained continuous radio communication using signal flags that conveyed information about wind conditions, tidal changes, and the position of approaching vessels that might interfere with the operation. This communication system incorporated codes that had been developed specifically for this project, combinations of colored flags that could convey complex information quickly enough to allow for real-time adjustments to deployment procedures. The actual positioning of the chain began when the Madonna della Grazia moved into position at precisely 9:47 a.m., a time selected based on tidal calculations that indicated optimal water conditions for the next 3 hours. The crew deployed anchor chains that had been measured to provide exactly the right scope for maintaining position while allowing for movement caused by wind and current. These calculations required understanding of scope ratios that determined how much anchor line needed to be deployed based on water depth and expected weather conditions. Measurements that seemed almost obsessively precise but proved essential for maintaining the precise positioning required for successful chain installation. The connection of individual chain sections required underwater operations that presented challenges seemingly more appropriate for deep-sea salvage than harbour defence. Teams of divers who had been trained specifically for this project worked in 30-minute shifts, using techniques that had been developed through experimentation with various connection methods. They carried tools that included specialized wrenches designed for underwater use and waterproof containers for storing connection hardware that would corrode rapidly if exposed to seawater for extended periods. The visibility in the harbour water rarely exceeded 6 feet, requiring them to work by touch and memory, developing mental maps of connection points that allowed them to perform complex operations in near-total darkness. The tensioning process that would remove slack from the deployed chain required understanding of stress distribution that seemed almost modern in its sophistication. The chain needed to maintain sufficient tension to prevent Ottoman vessels from passing over it while avoiding excessive stress that might cause individual links to fail under load conditions that could vary dramatically based on weather and tidal factors. This requirement led to the development of tensioning systems that incorporated both mechanical advantage through block and tackle arrangements and hydraulic principles that used water pressure to maintain consistent tension. As conditions changed throughout the day, the monitoring systems that tracked the chain's performance after deployment revealed the same attention to procedural details that had characterized every phase of the project. Teams conducted hourly inspections that included measurements of chain tension, water depth at various points along its length, and alignment with respect to the harbor bottom. These observations were recorded in logbooks that would eventually contain thousands of entries, creating databases that allowed engineers to identify trends and problems before they became critical. The inspection procedures included techniques for detecting metal fatigue that relied on sound quality when links were struck with small hammers, a method that required years of experience to interpret reliably but could identify developing failures weeks before they became visible. The integration of the chain with Constantinople's overall defensive system required coordination that seemed almost impossibly complex. Given the communication limitations of the period, the chain represented only one component of harbor defense that also included the physical fortifications along the seawalls, the naval vessels that patrolled the protected waters, and the artillery positions that could engage enemy ships that approached too closely. This integration required development of protocols that specified exactly when the chain would be deployed, under what conditions it might be temporarily removed to allow friendly vessels to pass, and how its deployment would be coordinated with other defensive measures. The weather conditions that had seemed favorable during the initial deployment began to change as the afternoon progressed, requiring real-time adjustments that tested the flexibility of the installation procedures. Wind speed increased to 12 knots, creating conditions that threatened to place excessive stress on the chain and its anchor points. The harbour master ordered precautionary measures that included deployment of additional anchor lines to provide extra support for the Madonna della Grazia and adjustment of tensioning systems to accommodate the changing load conditions. These modifications required coordination between teams that had not practiced together under these specific conditions, creating situations where improvisation became necessary while maintaining the precision required for continued effectiveness. As evening approached, the deployment operation neared completion with a degree of success that seemed almost anticlimactic given the elaborate preparations that had preceded it. The chain stretched across the Golden Horn in a graceful curve that incorporated exactly the right amount of sag to accommodate tidal variations while maintaining sufficient tension to prevent passage by enemy vessels. The anchor points held firm under loads that measured slightly less than the maximum capacity calculated by the engineers, providing a safety margin that would prove essential as weather conditions continued to change. The monitoring systems indicated that the installation had achieved its design objectives, creating a defensive barrier that would force Ottoman naval forces to either break the chain or find alternative approaches to attacking the city's seawalls. But in this apparent success lay also the recognition that the chain represented only a temporary solution to problems that extended far beyond harbour defence. The installation had succeeded according to the technical specifications established by the engineers, but it also created a form of naval warfare that both sides understood would eventually require resolution through either technical innovation or overwhelming force. The Ottomans who observed the deployment from positions around the harbour recognized that the chain had transformed their naval strategy from direct assault to either siege warfare or development of technologies that could overcome this new form of maritime defense. Whether the chain could maintain its effectiveness against enemies who had learned to weaponize change itself remained an open question that would be answered only through the prolonged testing that siege warfare would provide. The night brought with it the realization that the chain's deployment had created a new form of naval stalemate that both sides would need to address. through innovations that seemed almost impossible to predict. The defenders had succeeded in creating a defensive system that was uniquely Byzantine in its approach to seemingly impossible challenges, combining ancient engineering principles with innovative solutions to problems that had never been encountered before. Whether this combination would prove adequate against the revolutionary changes that approached remained uncertain, but it represented the only strategy available to those who understood that survival sometimes depended on transforming impossibility into temporary inconvenience through impossibly thorough preparation and execution. The morning of May 28, 1453, revealed the chain across the Golden Horn in a condition that seemed to defy the engineering calculations that had governed its deployment. Where once it had stretched in a graceful curve that incorporated exactly the right amount of sag to accommodate tidal variations, it now hung at an angle that violated every principle of proper installation. You could have observed the morning inspection team as they attempted to assess damage that had accumulated through weeks of artillery bombardment, weather stress, and the accumulated effects of supporting loads that had exceeded design parameters for longer than anyone had anticipated possible. The anchor points that had been constructed with apparently excessive conservatism now showed signs of stress that threatened complete failure. The northern anchor block, which had been quarried specifically for this project and positioned to provide support that seemed almost ridiculously adequate, had developed cracks that extended from the iron connection fittings outward through the limestone in patterns that indicated the stone itself was approaching its breaking point. The engineers who examined these damage patterns understood that they were witnessing not just mechanical failure, but the approaching end of a defensive system that had represented Constantinople's primary protection against naval attack. The chain links themselves exhibited deterioration that seemed almost impossible given the quality of materials and construction techniques that had been employed in their fabrication. The iron, which had been forged according to specifications that represented the highest available standards for maritime applications, showed evidence of fatigue that manifested as microscopic cracks propagating through the metal's crystalline structure. These failures occurred in locations that experienced the greatest stress concentrations, particularly at connection points where links joined together, and at the center of the span where the combination of chain weight and external loads created forces that exceeded the material's fatigue limits through repeated loading and unloading cycles. The measurement systems that had been established to monitor the chain's performance now recorded data that indicated approaching failure with mathematical precision that seemed almost cruel in its clarity. The tension measurements, which had been maintained within acceptable ranges through the first weeks of deployment, now showed fluctuations that indicated the structural system was approaching its elastic limits. The strain gauges that had been installed at critical points measured deformations that increased daily, creating trends that engineers could extrapolate to predict complete failure. Within a time frame that was measured not in weeks but in days or hours, the teams that had been assigned to maintain the chain now worked under conditions that made adequate maintenance increasingly difficult to accomplish. The constant threat of artillery fire from Ottoman positions around the harbour meant that inspection and repair work could be conducted only during brief periods when enemy attention was directed elsewhere. The materials needed for emergency repairs, replacement links, additional anchor hardware, and tools for underwater work were becoming scarce as the siege progressed and supply lines from friendly territories were cut off by Ottoman forces that controlled the surrounding countryside. The naval vessels that had been positioned to support the chain's operation now faced circumstances that made their continued presence increasingly hazardous. The Madonna della Grazia, which had served as the primary platform for deployment operations, had been damaged by artillery fire that had killed key members of her crew and destroyed equipment essential for maintaining the chain. The vessel remained operational, but only through improvisation that violated every principle of proper maritime procedure. Her crew, working with reduced numbers using tools that had been damaged or improvised from materials scavenged from other sources as the siege progressed. The integration of the chain with other defensive systems had broken down as the various components of Constantinople's harbour defence were destroyed or damaged through continued bombardment. The artillery positions that had provided protection for vessels working near the chain had been silenced, their crews killed or driven away by Ottoman fire that had systematically targeted defensive installations throughout the siege. The naval patrols that had been scheduled to monitor the chain's condition had been reduced in frequency as vessels were destroyed or reassigned to other defensive duties, leaving the chain without the support systems that had been designed to ensure its continued operation. The Ottoman forces that had been observing the chain's deterioration now prepared to exploit its failure through methods that demonstrated their understanding of both the engineering principles involved and the psychological impact that breaking this symbol of Byzantine resistance would create. They had positioned artillery specifically to target the anchor points, recognizing that the destruction of these critical connections would cause the entire system to fail catastrophically rather than gradually. Their bombardment had been calculated to achieve maximum psychological impact, timing the final assault on the chain to coincide with their overall attack on the city's defenses. The final failure occurred not through any single dramatic event, but through the accumulation of damage that exceeded the system's capacity to maintain structural integrity under load. The northern anchor block split along a fracture plane that had been developing for days, the stone failing in a manner that sent shock waves through the entire chain structure. The sudden release of tension caused adjacent links to experience loads that exceeded their individual capacity, creating a progressive failure that propagated through the system with the mathematical inevitability of a geometric progression. The collapse itself happened with a slowness that seemed almost deliberate, as if the chain itself understood the historical significance of its failure and wished to provide witnesses with adequate time to appreciate the symbolic importance of this moment. The links separated gradually under the combination of their own weight and the external loads that had been imposed, creating a series of splashes as massive iron segments fell into the harbour water with impacts that could be felt throughout the surrounding area. The sound of the collapse, beginning with the sharp crack of the anchor block failing and continuing through the lower rumble of chain sections striking the harbour bottom, created an acoustic experience that seemed to mark not just the end of a defensive system, but the approaching conclusion of Byzantine civilization itself. The aftermath of the chain's failure revealed the extent to which this seemingly mundane piece of maritime engineering had come to represent the larger strategic situation facing Constantinople. The broken links that lay on the harbour bottom served as physical evidence of the mathematical certainty that complex systems eventually approach their failure points, regardless of how carefully they have been designed and maintained. The anchor blocks that remained in place, but no longer served any functional purpose, represented the approaching obsolescence of defensive strategies that had been developed over centuries of experience with siege, warfare. The psychological impact of the chain's failure extended far beyond its immediate military significance. For the defenders who had witnessed its deployment with such hope for the protection it would provide, its collapse represented the approaching end of their capacity to resist the forces arrayed against them. For the Ottomans who had observed its construction and deployment with such concern about its potential effectiveness, its destruction represented confirmation that their innovative approaches to siege warfare could overcome even the most sophisticated defensive measures that Byzantine engineering could devise. As the day progressed toward its inevitable conclusion, the broken chain served as a physical reminder that civilizations don't typically collapse through spectacular failures, but through the gradual accumulation of damage that exceeds their capacity to maintain the systems that sustain their existence. The Byzantine Empire, which had survived through its ability to adapt to changing conditions while maintaining the essential elements of its identity, now faced circumstances where adaptation could no longer compensate for the fundamental mismatch between its traditional approaches to survival and the revolutionary changes that had transformed the nature of warfare itself. The final lesson of the chain's failure was both simple and profound, that even the most sophisticated applications of traditional knowledge and techniques eventually encounter problems that cannot be solved through more careful application of the same principles. The chain had represented the pinnacle of Byzantine engineering achievement, incorporating centuries of experience with maritime technology and defensive strategy. But it had ultimately failed because the conditions that had made such systems effective had ceased to exist. Whether this lesson would be understood by those who survived the fall of Constantinople remained uncertain, but the broken links that lay on the harbour bottom would serve as physical evidence that even the most carefully calculated resistance to change eventually encounters forces that cannot be overcome through more thorough preparation or more precise execution of traditional methods. The Hungarian engineer who would determine Constantinople's fate arrived in the city during the winter of 1452, carrying with him calculations that seemed almost impossibly ambitious for a man who had been unable to find steady employment in the courts of European monarchs who claimed to value technological innovation, but consistently failed to provide the resources necessary for its implementation. Urban's appearance at the imperial court represented the kind of encounter that would bore most historians, but proved essential for understanding how the fall of Constantinople resulted not from dramatic military betrayals, but from the mundane difficulties of funding technological development during periods of fiscal crisis. You could have observed Urban as he presented his proposals to Byzantine officials who understood the theoretical value of his innovations but lacked the financial resources to implement them. According to the specifications he had developed through years of experimentation with gunpowder weapons, his calculations indicated that a cannon capable of breaching the Theodosian walls would require a barrel length of 26 feet and an internal diameter of 30 inches, dimensions that seemed almost absurdly large to military commanders who had been trained to think of artillery as support weapons rather than primary instruments of siege warfare. The bronze required for such a weapon would weigh approximately 40,000 pounds, requiring an investment in raw materials alone that exceeded the annual military budget of the entire Byzantine Empire. The technical specifications that Urban had developed incorporated knowledge that had been accumulated through decades of experimentation with gunpowder weapons throughout Europe. The optimal powder charge for his proposed cannon would require 800 pounds of gunpowder, a quantity that needed to be manufactured according to precise formulas that specified the exact proportions of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal. The quality of these ingredients varied dramatically depending on their sources and preparation methods, requiring testing procedures that seemed almost alchemical in their complexity, but were essential for achieving consistent performance. Saltpeter from India produced different ballistic results than material from European sources, while sulfur from volcanic regions created different burning characteristics than deposits found in sedimentary formations. The projectile design represented another area where Urban's calculations required solutions to problems that had never been addressed on this scale. A stone ball weighing 1,200 pounds, the optimal projectile for his proposed cannon, needed to be quarried and shaped according to specifications that seemed almost impossibly precise given the limitations of contemporary stoneworking technology. The sphere needed to maintain its integrity during the violent acceleration that occurred when the powder charge exploded, while also achieving the aerodynamic properties necessary for accurate flight over distances exceeding a mile. These requirements led to quarrying techniques that had been developed for cathedral construction but were adapted for producing projectiles that needed to survive forces far greater than those encountered in architectural applications. The manufacturing process for cannon barrels of this size required foundry techniques that pushed the boundaries of contemporary metallurgy into regions that seemed almost experimental in their departure from established methods. The bronze casting needed to achieve uniform thickness throughout the barrel length while maintaining the structural integrity necessary to contain explosions that generated pressures exceeding 20,000 pounds per square inch. These requirements meant that foundry operations needed to maintain temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for periods that sometimes extended for days, consuming enormous quantities of fuel and requiring constant attention from craftsmen who had learned their skills through generations of experience with smaller-scale operations. The testing procedures that Auburn developed for validating his designs incorporated methods that seemed almost unnecessarily elaborate but were essential for understanding how weapons of this unprecedented scale would perform under actual combat conditions. The test firings required construction of specialized facilities that could withstand the forces generated by explosions that could be heard for distances exceeding 20 miles. These facilities incorporated measuring devices that could record the ballistic performance of projectiles weighing more than half a ton, measurements that needed to be taken at multiple points along the projectile's flight path to determine whether the weapon achieved the accuracy necessary for effective siege warfare. The financial calculations that determined whether Auburn's proposals could be implemented revealed the economic constraints that would ultimately prove more decisive than any military considerations in determining Constantinople's fate. The total cost for manufacturing his proposed supercannon included not just the raw materials and labor required for construction, but also the infrastructure improvements necessary to accommodate weapons of this unprecedented scale. The foundry operations needed to be expanded to handle the increased workload. Specialized transportation equipment had to be constructed to move the finished weapon to its deployment position, and new supply chains needed to be established to provide the enormous quantities of powder and shot required for effective operation. The strategic calculations that motivated Auburn's work incorporated understanding of siege warfare that seemed almost modern in its recognition that technological superiority could overcome numerical advantages that had traditionally determined the outcome of military confrontations. His analysis of previous siege attempts against Constantinople had convinced him that the city's walls could be breached only through application of force that exceeded the capacity of conventional artillery to deliver. This recognition had led him to develop designs that incorporated scaling factors that seemed almost absurd in their departure from contemporary practice, but were mathematically necessary to achieve the objective of creating breaches large enough to allow for successful assault by ground forces. The political calculations that influenced whether his proposals would be accepted involved negotiations that revealed the fundamental mismatch between Byzantine administrative traditions and the requirements for implementing technological innovations that were transforming military operations throughout Europe. The imperial court operated according to procedures that had been developed for managing traditional military forces, but proved inadequate for addressing the resource requirements of weapon systems that represented qualitative rather than quantitative improvements in siege warfare capability. The approval process for Auburn's proposals required decisions that exceeded the financial capacity of the Byzantine state, regardless of how clearly officials understood the theoretical value of his innovations. The time calculations that determined whether implementation of Auburn's designs could affect the outcome of the siege revealed constraints that made success impossible, regardless of how persuasive his arguments might be. The manufacturing process for his proposed cannon would require several months, even under optimal conditions, a timeline that exceeded the period available before Ottoman forces would complete their preparations for the final assault on Constantinople. These scheduling constraints meant that even if funding had been available for immediate implementation, the weapon could not be completed in time to influence the siege that would determine the city's fate. The quality calculations that governed whether Auburn's work would achieve its intended objectives incorporated factors that seemed almost philosophical in their consideration of how technological innovation could affect the balance of power between civilizations that were approaching. dramatically different conceptions of how warfare should be conducted. His recognition that larger artillery could overcome defensive systems that had been considered impregnable represented understanding that the conditions which had made Byzantine survival strategies effective for centuries were undergoing fundamental transformation. Whether this understanding could be translated into practical improvements in Constantinople's defensive capability remained uncertain, but it revealed the approaching obsolescence of traditional approaches to siege warfare that had characterized military operations throughout the medieval period. As negotiations for Orban's employment continued through the winter months, the calculations that determined his future employment revealed the approaching end of an era when technological innovation could be evaluated primarily according to its theoretical value rather than its immediate practical utility. The Byzantine Empire, which had survived through its ability to adapt to changing conditions while maintaining essential elements of its identity, now faced circumstances where adaptation required resources that exceeded its capacity to generate them, regardless of how clearly officials understood the advantages that new technologies might provide. Whether this recognition would influence the final outcome of the siege remained uncertain, but it documented the moment when traditional approaches to technological adoption encountered circumstances that made them irrelevant regardless of how carefully they had been developed through centuries of experience with incremental innovation and pragmatic implementation of theoretical knowledge. The transformation of Orban from an unemployed engineer seeking patronage to the architect of Constantinople's destruction occurred through negotiations that seemed almost mundane in their focus on practical details rather than the historical significance of the decisions being made. You could have observed the Hungarian craftsman as he presented his revised proposals to Ottoman officials who understood both the theoretical value of his innovations and the practical requirements for implementing them according to specifications that would achieve their strategic objectives. The meeting took place in Edirne during February 1453 in chambers where the temperature was maintained at approximately 65 degrees through charcoal braziers that created the comfortable environment necessary for extended discussions of technical details that would determine the fate of empires. The financial arrangements that Sultan Mehmed II offered to Orban represented investments that seemed almost ridiculously generous compared to the meager stipends that Byzantine officials had considered adequate for supporting the same work. The Ottoman court authorized payment of exactly 100 gold pieces per month, a sum that exceeded the annual income of most craftsmen in any European city, plus allocation of materials and labor resources that seemed almost unlimited in their scope. These resources included not just the bronze required for cannon construction, but also the specialized facilities needed for manufacturing weapons of unprecedented size, the skilled craftsmen necessary for implementing Orban's designs, and the supporting infrastructure required for transporting and deploying these massive weapon systems. The foundry operations that were established to manufacture Orban's supercannons represented industrial facilities that seemed almost modern in their scale and organization. The primary facility, constructed specifically for this project near the Ottoman capital at Edirne, incorporated furnaces that could maintain the high temperatures necessary for casting bronze objects weighing tens of thousands of pounds. These furnaces required fuel supplies that included both charcoal and coal, materials that needed to be transported from sources that sometimes lay hundreds of miles away, using logistics systems that seemed almost impossibly elaborate for medieval military operations. The daily consumption of fuel for foundry operations alone exceeded the requirements of entire villages, creating supply chains that demonstrated the Ottoman capacity for organizing resources on a scale that European states could not match. The labor force that assembled to implement Orban's designs included craftsmen whose skills represented the accumulated technical knowledge of civilizations that stretched from Central Europe to the Middle East. The bronze casters who had learned their techniques through generations of experience with church bell manufacturing, found themselves applying their knowledge to weapons that incorporated the same principles but operated at scales that seemed almost absurd in their departure from traditional practice. The blacksmiths who specialized in creating the reinforcing bands that would prevent cannon barrels from bursting under the enormous pressures generated by powder explosions worked with techniques that had been developed for siege engine construction, but were being adapted for applications that exceeded anything they had previously attempted. The quality control procedures that Auburn established for manufacturing his super cannons incorporated testing methods that seemed almost obsessively thorough in their attention to identifying potential failure points before weapons were deployed in combat conditions. Each cannon barrel underwent stress testing that included filling the interior with water and applying pressures that simulated the forces generated by actual powder explosions. These tests required construction of specialized facilities that could safely contain the enormous forces involved while allowing engineers to measure whether the metal could withstand repeated firings without developing cracks that might lead to catastrophic failure during combat operations. The transportation of completed cannons from the foundry to their deployment positions required logistical planning that seemed almost impossibly elaborate given the technological limitations of the period. A single super cannon weighing 40,000 pounds needed to be moved across distances that sometimes exceeded 100 miles using road systems that had been designed for carts carrying loads that rarely exceeded 1 ton. This requirement led to development of transportation methods that incorporated techniques from both civil and military engineering, including the construction of specialized wagons that distributed loads across multiple axles and the reinforcement of bridges and road surfaces to accommodate weights that would have caused immediate failure. Under normal conditions, the deployment of these weapons around Constantinople required site preparation that seemed almost archaeological in its scope and complexity. Each cannon position needed to be excavated and reinforced to provide stable platforms that could absorb the enormous recoil forces generated when these weapons were fired. The excavation for a single super cannon position required removal of approximately 500 cubic yards of earth, creating foundations that incorporated stone blocks weighing several tons each. These foundations needed to be constructed according to specifications that seemed almost unnecessarily precise but were essential for ensuring that cannons could maintain accuracy over the extended periods required for successful siege operations. The powder manufacturing operations that supplied Auburn's weapons incorporated chemical processes that seemed almost alchemical in their transformation of raw materials into the explosive compounds necessary for effective artillery operations. The saltpeter that formed the primary component of gunpowder needed to be purified through crystallization techniques that removed impurities that could affect burning characteristics. Processes that required understanding of chemical principles that were only beginning to be understood systematically during this period. The sulfur and charcoal components needed to be prepared according to specifications that affected not just the explosive force generated, but also the consistency with which powder burned, characteristics that determined whether projectiles achieved the range and accuracy necessary for effective siege warfare. The projectile manufacturing operations that supported Auburn's cannons required quarrying and shaping techniques that seemed almost absurdly elaborate for producing what were essentially large rocks. The stone balls that weighed 1,200 pounds each needed to be shaped into spheres that maintained their structural integrity during the violent acceleration that occurred when powder charges exploded, while also achieving the aerodynamic properties necessary for accurate flight over distances that sometimes exceeded 1 mile. These requirements led to development of stoneworking techniques that incorporated knowledge from cathedral construction but were adapted for applications that required precision. Measurements that seemed almost modern in their sophistication. The training of crews who would operate these weapons incorporated procedures that seemed almost unnecessarily complex given the straightforward nature of artillery operations, but were essential for achieving the consistency necessary for effective siege warfare. Each crew member needed to understand not just their individual responsibilities, but also how their actions affected the overall performance of weapons that operated at scales that made minor variations in procedures potentially significant in determining whether bombardment achieved its intended objectives. This training required development of communication systems that could coordinate activities among crews working at multiple positions around the city, creating organizational structures that seemed almost modern in their complexity. The integration of Auburn's cannons with other aspects of the siege required coordination that seemed almost impossibly elaborate given the communication limitations of the period. The artillery bombardment needed to be synchronized with mining operations, infantry assaults, and naval activities in ways that required planning procedures that seemed almost modern in their attention to timing and coordination. This integration required development of command structures that could make real-time adjustments to tactics based on changing conditions while maintaining the overall strategic coherence necessary for achieving the siege objectives within timeframes that political considerations made essential. The economic calculations that determined whether this massive investment in new weapons technology would prove cost-effective incorporated factors that seemed almost philosophical in their consideration of how technological superiority could affect the balance of power between civilizations. The total cost of implementing Auburn's designs, including not just the cannons themselves, but also the supporting infrastructure, trained crews, and logistical systems required for their effective operation, exceeded the annual revenues of many European states. However, these costs needed to be evaluated against the strategic value of possessing weapons that could overcome defensive systems that had been considered impregnable for centuries, calculations that seemed almost prophetic in their recognition that technological innovation could provide decisive advantages in military confrontations. As the siege progressed toward its inevitable conclusion, the performance of Auburn's cannons validated the theoretical calculations that had guided their design while also revealing limitations that would shape the development of artillery technology for decades to come. The weapons achieved the range and accuracy necessary for creating breaches in the Theodosian walls, but they also demonstrated that massive cannons required logistical support that sometimes seemed disproportionate to their military effectiveness. The rate of fire for these weapons rarely exceeded 6 shots per day due to the enormous effort required for preparation, loading, and cooling between firings. Limitations that meant successful siege operations required patience and resources that few military forces could sustain regardless of how decisive artillery fire might prove when conditions allowed for its effective employment. The final success of Auburn's cannons in breaching Constantinople's walls represented validation of the theoretical principles that had guided his design work while also documenting the moment when traditional approaches to siege warfare became obsolete regardless of how sophisticated they had become through centuries of incremental refinement. The Byzantine defensive systems, which had survived through their ability to adapt to changing conditions while maintaining essential elements of their design, had finally encountered weapons that operated according to principles that made traditional fortification methods irrelevant regardless of how carefully they had been maintained through the patient accumulation of small advantages that had characterized Byzantine survival strategies for a millennium. The morning of May 29, 1453, brought with it the final calculations that would determine whether Auburn's theoretical understanding of artillery effectiveness could be translated into the practical destruction of defensive systems that had protected Constantinople for over a millennium. You could have observed the Hungarian engineer as he supervised the final preparations for what would become the most significant artillery bombardment in human history to that date, checking measurements that seemed almost obsessively precise given the scale of destruction his weapons were designed to achieve. The bronze barrels of his supercannons had been cooled overnight with water-soaked cloths to ensure they maintained the optimal temperature for firing, while the powder charges, each containing exactly 800 pounds of specially prepared gunpowder, had been measured and remeasured to ensure consistency and performance that would be essential for creating breaches large enough to allow successful infantry assault the stone projectiles that would be fired during the final bombardment, represented the culmination of weeks of quarrying and shaping operations that had been conducted according to specifications Auburn had developed through systematic experimentation with ballistics principles that were only beginning to be understood mathematically during this period. Each sphere weighed exactly 1,200 pounds and had been shaped using techniques that incorporated knowledge from both architectural stoneworking and the emerging science of projectile design. The granite used for these projectiles had been selected specifically for its structural properties, quarried from deposits that could provide stone capable of maintaining integrity during the violent acceleration that occurred when powder charges exploded with forces that could be heard for distances exceeding 20 miles. The final positioning of Auburn's cannons required adjustments that seemed almost impossibly precise, given the scale of destruction these weapons were designed to achieve. The artillery positions that had been constructed through weeks of excavation and reinforcement needed to be modified based on observations of how previous bombardment had affected the Theodosian walls. The angle of elevation for each cannon required modification using mathematical calculations that incorporated understanding of both ballistic trajectories and the structural weaknesses that had been identified in the wall's construction through systematic observation of damage patterns created by earlier firing. These adjustments needed to be completed within time frames measured in hours rather than days, creating working conditions that seemed almost absurd in their compression of procedures that normally required extended periods for proper completion. The powder charges that would be used during the final bombardment had been manufactured according to formulas that Auburn had refined through experimentation, with different proportions of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal. The optimal mixture for maximum projectile velocity required exactly 75% saltpeter, 15% charcoal, and 10% sulfur by weight, proportions that needed to be maintained with precision that seemed almost unnecessarily exacting given the apparent straightforwardness of the manufacturing process. The grinding and mixing operations required to achieve this uniformity had been conducted using techniques that incorporated both traditional methods from pharmaceutical manufacturing and innovations that Auburn had developed specifically for large-scale powder production. The firing sequence that Auburn had developed for the final bombardment incorporated timing that seemed almost musical in its coordination of multiple weapon systems operating simultaneously. The supercannons needed to be fired at intervals that allowed each barrel to cool sufficiently between shots while maintaining the continuous pressure on wall defenders that was essential for preventing effective repair of damage that accumulated through extended bombardment. This timing required understanding of thermal properties that seemed almost modern in their sophistication, incorporating calculations about how bronze barrels dissipated heat under various atmospheric conditions and how this cooling rate affected the safe loading of subsequent powder charges. The crews who would operate these weapons during the final assault had been trained according to procedures that Auburn had developed through analysis of both successful and unsuccessful artillery operations throughout Europe. Each crew member needed to understand not just their individual responsibilities, but also how their actions affected the performance of weapons that operated at scales where minor variations in procedure could result in significant differences in effectiveness. The loading process alone required coordination between teams that handled projectiles weighing more than half a ton and powder charges that needed to be positioned with precision that seemed almost impossible when working with materials that were inherently unstable and dangerous to handle. The targeting calculations that guided the final bombardment incorporated knowledge that Auburn had accumulated through systematic observation of how artillery fire affected different types of stonework and construction techniques. The Theodosian walls incorporated multiple layers of masonry that had been constructed according to engineering principles developed over centuries, and creating effective breaches required understanding how these different materials would respond to the impact forces generated by projectiles traveling at velocities that sometimes exceeded 1,000 feet per second. These calculations required application of principles that seemed almost modern in their consideration of both kinetic energy transfer and the structural weaknesses that accumulated through repeated impact at specific locations. The measurement systems that Orban employed to evaluate the effectiveness of his bombardment incorporated techniques that seemed almost scientific in their attention to quantifying the result, achieved through extended artillery fire. The depth of wall damage needed to be measured not just in linear dimensions, but also in terms of how the structural integrity of the entire defensive system was affected by the accumulation of damage at specific points. These measurements required understanding of engineering principles that allowed engineers to predict when sections of wall would collapse under their own weight, creating breaches that were large enough and stable enough to support infantry assault. The integration of Orban's artillery with other aspects of the Ottoman assault required coordination that seemed almost impossibly complex. Given the communication limitations of the period, the bombardment needed to be synchronized with mining operations that were attempting to undermine wall foundations while also maintaining the psychological pressure on defenders that was essential for preventing effective organization of resistance as the assault progressed. This integration required development of signal systems that could coordinate activities across distances that sometimes exceeded 1 mile while maintaining the flexibility necessary to adjust tactics in response to changing conditions as the attack developed. The final evaluation of bombardment effectiveness required analysis that seemed almost statistical in its comparison of resource expenditure with results achieved through extended artillery operations. The total investment in Orban's artillery system, including not just the cannons themselves but also the supporting infrastructure, powder manufacturing, projectile shaping, and crew training, represented costs that exceeded the annual revenues of most contemporary states. However, these costs needed to be evaluated against the strategic value of achieving the first successful breach of Constantinople's walls in over a millennium, calculations that seemed almost revolutionary in their recognition that technological superiority could provide decisive advantages, regardless of how carefully traditional defensive systems had been maintained. As the final bombardment progressed toward its inevitable conclusion, the mathematics of destruction that Orban had developed achieved results that validated the theoretical calculations which had guided his design work, while also documenting the moment when quantitative improvements in military technology achieved qualitative changes in the nature of siege warfare itself. The breaches created in the Theodosian walls represented not just the failure of a specific defensive system, but the approaching obsolescence of fortification methods that had been considered impregnable for centuries, regardless of how carefully they had been maintained through the patient accumulation of incremental improvements that had characterized military engineering throughout the medieval period. The final success of Orban's mathematical approach to siege warfare marked the conclusion not just of the Byzantine Empire, but of an entire approach to military engineering that had assumed traditional defensive systems could maintain their effectiveness through incremental refinement, regardless of how dramatically the underlying conditions of warfare might change. The calculations that had guided his work represented understanding that technological innovation could provide decisive advantages in military confrontations, recognition that would shape the development of artillery technology for centuries to come, and establish the principles that would govern military engineering long after the specific weapons he had designed became obsolete through the continuing process of technological innovation that his success had helped to initiate. The final census of the Byzantine Empire began on March 15, 1453, when Emperor Constantine X issued the order that would document the human resources available for defending Constantinople against the Ottoman forces that were completing their preparations for the siege that would determine the empire's survival. You could have observed the census takers as they moved through neighborhoods that had been established centuries earlier, carrying tablets that would record information essential for organizing the city's defense, but that would also create the most detailed demographic record of Byzantine civilization ever compiled. These officials understood that they were documenting not just numbers for military planning, but the final accounting of a civilization that had endured for over 1,000 years and was now approaching its conclusion with mathematical precision that seemed almost cruel in its clarity. The census procedures that had been developed for this final enumeration incorporated methods that seemed almost modern in their attention to collecting detailed information about the population's characteristics and capabilities. Each household needed to provide information about the number of adult males available for military service, their previous combat experience, their physical condition, and their possession of weapons or armor that might prove useful for defensive operations. However, the census also collected information about family relationships, property ownership, and occupational skills that would be essential for maintaining the city's economy during the extended siege that everyone understood was approaching with inevitable certainty. The administrative infrastructure that supported this census represented organizational capabilities that had been refined through centuries of practice with collecting taxes, organizing military service, and maintaining public order throughout the empire's territories. The census takers themselves had been selected from among the empire's most experienced administrators, men who had spent decades developing the skills necessary for collecting accurate information from populations that sometimes viewed government inquiries with suspicion or hostility. They carried identification documents that had been prepared using techniques developed for imperial correspondence, wax seals that authenticated their authority and provided protection against the harassment that census takers sometimes encountered when their questions touched on sensitive information about family resources or personal capabilities. The neighborhoods that these officials documented represented the accumulated history of urban development that had transformed Constantinople from a Roman colonial settlement into the capital of what remained of the Eastern Roman Empire. Each quarter had its own distinctive characteristics that affected how census operations needed to be conducted. From the narrow streets of the commercial districts where merchants lived above their shops to the spacious mansions of the aristocratic quarters where multiple generations of the same family occupied compounds that sometimes encompassed entire city blocks. The census procedures needed to be adapted for each type of neighborhood, creating documentation methods that seemed almost unnecessarily complex but were essential for ensuring that information was collected completely and accurately. Regardless of local conditions, the commercial districts presented particular challenges that required census procedures incorporating knowledge of business operations that seemed almost archaeological in their attention to documenting economic activities that had been conducted according to traditions established centuries earlier. The merchant families who dominated these quarters maintained records of their business transactions that sometimes stretched back for generations, documents that provided information about trade, relationships extending from England to India, but that also revealed how the empire's commercial networks had been shrinking as Ottoman expansion progressively cut off access to markets that had been essential for Byzantine prosperity. These business records contained information that supplemented the census data, creating demographic profiles that documented not just population characteristics but also the economic resources that would be available for supporting extended defensive operations. The residential neighborhoods that housed the city's artisans and laborers revealed social structures that had been maintained through centuries of adaptation to changing political and economic conditions. The census takers documented family relationships that sometimes extended through 4 or 5 generations living in the same household, kinship networks that provided support during difficult periods, but that also created obligations that would complicate decisions about how to allocate limited resources during the siege. These family structures incorporated knowledge about survival strategies that had been developed through previous crises, information that would prove essential for organizing civilian defense efforts, but that also revealed how the population's social organization would affect military planning as the crisis deepened. The aristocratic quarters presented different challenges that required census procedures, incorporating understanding of social hierarchies that had been maintained through traditions that sometimes violated the empire's legal codes but represented practical adaptations to circumstances that had evolved over centuries. The great families who lived in these districts maintained households that included not just immediate family members, but also extensive retinues of servants, clients, and dependents whose relationships to their patrons created obligations that would complicate decisions about military service and resource allocation during the siege. These households sometimes encompassed populations of several hundred people, creating demographic units that needed to be documented as complex social systems rather than simple collections of individuals. The religious institutions that dominated the city's landscape represented organizational structures that would affect how census information could be collected and how the population would respond to government directives during the siege. The monasteries that housed communities of monks, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, maintained records of their membership that supplemented the census data, but that also revealed how religious authority would interact with imperial command during the crisis. The parish churches that served the city's neighborhoods created networks of communication that would be essential for disseminating information and organizing collective responses to changing conditions as the siege progressed. The census procedures also needed to account for the foreign communities that had established permanent settlements in Constantinople, groups whose legal status and obligations to the empire created complexities that required careful documentation to avoid diplomatic complications during the crisis. The Genoese merchants who controlled the Galata quarter across the Golden Horn maintained their own records of population and property, but were also subject to imperial authority in ways that created overlapping jurisdictions, requiring coordination between different administrative systems. The Venetian community that occupied its own district within the city walls represented similar complications, while smaller communities from regions ranging from Catalonia to Crimea added layers of complexity that made comprehensive documentation seem almost impossibly difficult to achieve. The physical infrastructure that supported census operations revealed the same attention to procedural details that characterized every aspect of Byzantine administration. The census takers worked from offices that had been established throughout the city, each equipped with the supplies necessary for recording information and maintaining security of the documents they created. These offices incorporated archival systems that allowed for cross-referencing of information collected by different teams, creating databases that could be updated as conditions changed and new information became available. The wax tablets used for preliminary recording provided flexibility for making corrections and additions, while the parchment copies that served as permanent records were prepared using techniques that ensured they would survive the extended periods required for siege planning and implementation. The training that census takers received for this final enumeration incorporated knowledge that had been accumulated through centuries of experience with collecting information from populations that sometimes viewed government inquiries with suspicion or hostility. They learned techniques for asking questions in ways that would elicit accurate information while avoiding the confrontations that could arise when their inquiries touched on sensitive subjects such as family wealth or personal, physical limitations that might affect military service. They also learned methods for verifying information through cross-referencing different sources, techniques that seemed almost unnecessarily elaborate, but were essential for ensuring that the data collected would prove reliable when used for making decisions that would affect the city's survival. As the census neared completion during the final days of March 1453, the demographic profile that emerged revealed the mathematical reality that would determine Constantinople's fate with a clarity that seemed almost mathematical in its precision. The total population of the city and its immediate suburbs amounted to approximately 47,000 people, of whom only about 12,000 were adult males capable of military service. However, this number included elderly men, individuals with physical disabilities, and foreigners whose loyalty to the empire remained uncertain, regardless of how long they had resided within the city walls. The actual number of men who could be relied upon for effective military service amounted to slightly fewer than 8,000, a force that would need to defend 14 miles of walls against an Ottoman army that contemporary estimates placed at between 80,000 and 120,000 men. The census also revealed economic realities that would prove as decisive as demographic limitations in determining the city's capacity to resist the siege that was approaching with mathematical inevitability. The empire's treasury contained sufficient funds to pay military salaries for perhaps 6 weeks at standard rates, while the food reserves that had been stockpiled could sustain the population for slightly more than 2 months if consumption were maintained at minimal levels. These calculations assumed that no additional refugees would arrive seeking protection within the city walls and that no unexpected expenses would arise requiring diversion of resources from their designated purposes, assumptions that proved optimistic as the crisis deepened and the inevitable pressures of siege warfare began to affect every aspect of urban administration. The final entries in the census records were made during the last week of March 1453, creating documents that represented not just demographic information, but the approaching end of an administrative tradition that had been maintained for over 1,000 years. The clerks who made these final entries understood that they were completing work that would have no successor, documenting characteristics of a civilization that was approaching its conclusion with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized their service throughout careers that had sometimes extended for decades. Whether this documentation would serve any purpose beyond providing historically valuable information about the final days of the Byzantine Empire remained uncertain, but it represented the completion of administrative processes that had sustained imperial government through centuries of adaptation to changing conditions while maintaining essential elements of their original character. The statistical analysis of census data that occupied imperial administrators during early April 1453 revealed mathematical realities that would determine Constantinople's fate with a precision that seemed almost cruel in its clarity. You could have observed the officials who worked through calculations that would have bored most military commanders but proved essential for understanding how the city's resources could be allocated to maximize the probability of survival during the siege that everyone understood was approaching with inevitable certainty. These calculations incorporated variables ranging from the daily caloric requirements for different categories of the population to the manpower needed for maintaining defensive positions along 14 miles of walls, creating systems of equations that seemed almost unnecessarily complex but were essential for making decisions that would literally determine who would live and who would die during the coming weeks. The food distribution calculations required understanding of nutritional requirements that seemed almost modern in their attention to the biological needs of populations under stress conditions. Adult males engaged in heavy physical labor such as wall maintenance or military training required approximately 3,000 calories per day to maintain effectiveness, while women and children needed between 1,500 and 2,000 calories depending on their age and activity levels. However, these requirements needed to be evaluated against availability that was measured not just in total quantities but also in the types of food that could provide the nutritional balance necessary for maintaining health during extended periods of reduced caloric intake. considerations that seemed almost clinical in their attention to dietary science but were essential for maximizing the effectiveness of limited food reserves. The population distribution analysis revealed spatial patterns that would prove decisive for organizing defensive operations because they determined how manpower could be allocated most effectively across the city's extensive fortifications. The neighborhoods that housed the highest concentrations of adult males were located primarily in the commercial districts near the Golden Horn and the artisan quarters in the city's southern sections, areas that were distant from the most vulnerable sections of the defensive walls. This distribution created logistical challenges that required transportation systems for moving defenders to positions where they were most needed while also maintaining the economic activities that would be essential for sustaining the population during extended siege operations. Requirements that seemed almost impossibly complex given the limited resources available for supporting such movements. The economic calculations that determined how long the city could maintain operations revealed financial constraints that were as restrictive as demographic limitations in determining Constantinople's capacity to resist the siege. The imperial treasury contained sufficient precious metals to pay military salaries for perhaps 8 weeks at reduced rates, but these funds needed to be evaluated against the purchasing power they could command in markets that were becoming increasingly constrained as Ottoman forces tightened their blockade of the city. The hyperpyron, which had served as the empire's standard currency for centuries, was experiencing inflation that reduced its value by approximately 20% per week as the crisis deepened and confidence in the empire's survival evaporated among merchants who had previously accepted imperial currency at face value. The labor force calculations required analysis of skill distributions that seemed almost sociological in their attention to how different types of expertise could be applied most effectively during siege conditions. The census had identified approximately 2,000 men who possessed skills directly relevant to military operations: blacksmiths who could repair weapons, carpenters who could construct siege defenses, and physicians who could treat wounded soldiers. However, this number included individuals whose skills were specialized for peacetime applications and might not translate effectively to emergency conditions, requiring assessment procedures that seemed almost unnecessarily detailed but were essential for making optimal use of limited human resources. Like the time calculations that determined how long various systems could be maintained revealed constraints that made long-term survival impossible regardless of how carefully resources were allocated. The water supply system, which had been designed to serve a population of several 100,000 during the empire's peak, could provide adequate supplies for the current population for approximately 12 weeks if the aqueducts remained intact and cistern systems continued to function properly. However, these calculations assumed that no damage would occur to the infrastructure during bombardment, and that consumption would be maintained at minimal levels, regardless of how the psychological stress of siege conditions might affect usage patterns. Assumptions that proved optimistic as the crisis deepened. The probability calculations that governed strategic decision-making incorporated factors that seemed almost actuarial in their attention to risk assessment and contingency planning. The likelihood that relief forces would arrive from Europe needed to be evaluated against historical precedents that suggested such assistance rarely materialized when promised, while the probability that Ottoman forces might abandon the siege needed to be assessed against evidence that Mehmed II had committed resources to this campaign that exceeded any previous Ottoman military operation. These calculations required information about enemy capabilities and intentions that was necessarily incomplete but was essential for making decisions about how to allocate resources between immediate defensive needs and longer-term survival strategies. The integration of demographic, economic, and logistical calculations required mathematical techniques that seemed almost modern in their sophistication. The linear programming methods that would be developed centuries later for optimizing resource allocation had their primitive equivalents in the tabulation systems that Byzantine administrators used to evaluate trade-offs between competing demands for limited resources. These systems allowed officials to identify solutions that maximize the effectiveness of their constraints while also revealing when mathematical optimization could not overcome the fundamental reality that available resources were insufficient for achieving survival objectives, regardless of how carefully they were managed. The psychological calculations that influenced how census information could be used required understanding of morale factors that seemed almost behavioral in their attention to how populations respond to crisis conditions. The decision-making processes that determined when to inform citizens about the mathematical realities confronting them needed to balance the need for realistic assessment against the risk of creating fatalism that might undermine defensive efforts regardless of how carefully resource allocation might be optimized. These calculations required information about human psychology that was necessarily speculative, but was essential for making decisions about how to maintain the social cohesion necessary for collective survival during crisis conditions. The communication systems that coordinated census data collection revealed organizational capabilities that had been maintained through centuries of practice with administering complex societies, but were now being applied to problems that seemed almost unprecedented in their demands for real-time information processing. The messenger networks that relayed information between census teams and central administration operated according to schedules that seemed almost unnecessarily rapid given the apparently static nature of demographic data, but were essential for making adjustments as conditions changed during the approach of the siege. These systems incorporated error-checking procedures that seemed almost modern in their attention to ensuring information accuracy, regardless of the physical challenges involved in maintaining communication networks under crisis conditions. The siege began during early April 1453. The mathematical realities revealed through census analysis became increasingly stark through the daily calculations that tracked how rapidly resources were being consumed and how quickly the population's capacity for resistance was being exhausted. The food reserves that had seemed adequate when measured against normal consumption patterns proved insufficient when psychological stress created demand for additional comfort that could not be satisfied without compromising the nutritional requirements essential for maintaining defensive effectiveness. The water supply that had appeared sufficient when measured against theoretical minimums became constrained when minor damage to distribution systems created bottlenecks that could not be repaired without diverting manpower from critical defensive positions. The final calculations that occupied imperial administrators during late April and early May 1453 revealed the mathematical certainty that the systems which had sustained Byzantine civilization were approaching their terminal points, regardless of how carefully resources might be reallocated or how effectively remaining stocks might be managed. The rate of resource consumption had exceeded the rate at which essential supplies could be conserved through rationing, while the rate at which defensive capacity was being exhausted through casualties and fatigue exceeded the rate at which replacements could be trained or repositioned from less critical areas of responsibility. These trends could be expressed mathematically as differential equations that approached zero asymptotically, creating predictions that were accurate within days regardless of how many variables were included in the calculations. The night before the final assault brought the realization that the mathematics of survival had become impossibly simple. The equations that had occupied so much administrative attention throughout the siege had resolved into basic arithmetic that could be calculated mentally. The number of able-bodied defenders was being reduced daily, while the number of attackers remained essentially unchanged, while the resources available for sustaining defense were being consumed more rapidly than they could be replaced, regardless of how carefully remaining stocks might be conserved. Whether this mathematical certainty had been understood by those who had maintained hope for survival remained uncertain, but it represented the final confirmation that the civilization which had been documented so meticulously through the census process was approaching its conclusion, with the mathematical inevitability of a geometric progression approaching its limit. The morning of May 29, 1453, brought with it the final realization that the census data, which had been collected with such meticulous attention to detail, had documented the existence of a civilization that was approaching its conclusion with mathematical precision that seemed almost cruel in its clarity. You could have observed the final administrative acts that occurred as Constantinople fell, completing documentation that had been maintained with boring regularity throughout the siege, but that now served primarily as historical evidence of how complex societies approach their terminal points through the gradual exhaustion of the systems that sustain their existence. These final entries, made by clerks who understood they were recording the end of their world, represented the completion of administrative processes that had been maintained for over 1,000 years with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized their operation. During periods of prosperity and stability, the population figures that emerged from the final days of the siege revealed demographic collapse that occurred with shocking rapidity once the defensive systems that had protected the city were breached. The 47,000 people who had been documented during the March census had been reduced to perhaps 30,000 survivors who remained within the city walls when Ottoman forces completed their occupation. However, these numbers included individuals whose survival had been achieved through methods that violated every principle of social organization that had sustained Byzantine civilization. People who had hidden in cisterns, abandoned buildings, and other locations where they existed in conditions that bore no resemblance to the organized society that the census had been designed to document. The economic records that were completed during the final days revealed the complete exhaustion of resources that had seemed adequate when measured against theoretical requirements, but had proved insufficient when actual. Consumption exceeded projected needs by margins that made long-term survival impossible. The imperial treasury contained exactly 2847 hyperpyra when the city fell, an amount that represented less than 1 week's military salaries at the reduced rates that had been implemented as the crisis deepened. The food reserves had been consumed completely, with the last distribution occurring 3 days before the final assault, creating the conditions of hunger and weakness that affected both military effectiveness and civilian morale during the decisive final hours. The physical documentation that had been maintained throughout the census process now served purposes that seemed almost archaeological in their attention to preserving evidence of how complex civilizations approach their terminal points. The wax tablets that had been used for preliminary recording were destroyed or abandoned as the administrative system that had supported them ceased to function, while the parchment copies that represented permanent records were either taken by survivors who fled the city or remained as physical evidence of bureaucratic systems that had outlived the societies they had been designed to serve. These documents contained information that would prove invaluable to historians seeking to understand the final days of the Byzantine Empire, but they also represented the completion of administrative processes that could not be continued under the new political arrangements. That Ottoman conquest would establish the family records that had been collected through census operations revealed the destruction of social networks that had been maintained through centuries of adaptation to changing political and economic conditions. The extended family structures that had provided support during previous crises had been shattered through the selective casualties that occurred during the final assault, with some households losing all adult males while others survived intact through combinations of luck and positioning that seemed almost random in their distribution of survival and death. These family units, which had represented the fundamental social organization of Byzantine society, could not be reconstructed under the new political arrangements that Ottoman conquest established, creating social discontinuities that would affect the region for generations. Regardless of how carefully survivors might attempt to maintain traditional relationships. The property records that had been maintained through centuries of legal precedent became irrelevant when the concept of private property ownership was transformed through the systematic confiscation and redistribution that accompanied Ottoman occupation. The great family compounds that had housed multiple generations of aristocratic households were either destroyed during the final assault or appropriated for use by Ottoman officials who had no connection to the legal traditions that had governed property rights under Byzantine administration. The commercial properties that had been documented through detailed records extending back for generations were either abandoned by owners who fled or transferred to new residents who established claims based on Ottoman rather than Byzantine legal principles. The religious institutions that had been counted so carefully through census operations revealed the approaching end of organizational structures that had sustained Orthodox Christianity as the state religion of the Byzantine Empire. The monasteries that had housed communities, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, were either destroyed during the final assault or converted to purposes that bore no resemblance to their original functions as centers of religious scholarship and spiritual guidance. The parish churches that had served as the foundation for Christian worship throughout the city were either transformed into mosques or abandoned as the population that had supported them was either killed during the assault or enslaved under arrangements that made continued Christian worship impossible within the new political framework. The foreign communities that had been documented through census operations experienced transformations that were equally dramatic in their destruction of established relationships that had been maintained through decades or centuries of residence within Constantinople. The Genoese merchants who had controlled the Galata quarter found their commercial privileges revoked under arrangements that transferred trading rights to Ottoman subjects, while the Venetian community that had occupied its own district within the city walls was either expelled or required to accept legal status that made their continued residence dependent on acceptance of Ottoman political authority. The smaller communities from regions throughout the Mediterranean world were either absorbed into the new political arrangements or disappeared completely as their members were killed, enslaved or dispersed throughout territories controlled by Ottoman forces. The census workers themselves who had conducted the final enumeration of Byzantine civilization experienced fates that seemed almost symbolic in their representation of how administrative systems confront their own extinction. Some continued their work under Ottoman supervision, maintaining records for their new rulers using techniques that had been developed for Byzantine administration, but that now served purposes that bore no resemblance to their original functions as instruments for governing the Christian empire. Others died during the final assault or were enslaved under arrangements that made their professional skills irrelevant, regardless of how valuable their expertise might have been. Under different political circumstances, the knowledge they possessed about demographic analysis and administrative procedures could not be transferred to the new political system that Ottoman conquest established, creating discontinuities that would affect how the region was governed for generations, regardless of how carefully survivors might attempt to maintain traditional methods. The statistical summary that could be compiled from the final census records revealed mathematical truths that documented the approaching end of Byzantine civilization with precision that seemed almost clinical in its attention to quantifying the destruction of a complex society. The survival rate for adult males who had been available for military service amounted to approximately 35%, while civilian casualties exceeded 50% regardless of age or gender categories. The property losses approached 100% for the great aristocratic families that had dominated imperial politics, while commercial losses exceeded 80%, even for merchants who had survived the final assault and retained sufficient mobility to flee to territories that remained outside Ottoman control. The final lesson that emerged from this demographic documentation was both simple and profound, that complex civilizations don't typically collapse through spectacular failures, but through the gradual exhaustion of the systems that sustain their existence until they reach points where continued survival becomes mathematically impossible, regardless of how carefully remaining resources might be managed. The Byzantine Empire, which had survived through its ability to adapt to changing conditions while maintaining essential elements of its identity, had finally encountered circumstances where adaptation could no longer compensate for the fundamental mismatch between its traditional approaches to survival and the revolutionary changes that had transformed the conditions under which its existence could be sustained. The census records that survived the fall of Constantinople would serve purposes that their creators could never have anticipated, providing historians with detailed information about how complex societies approach their terminal points through processes that seem almost mathematical in their attention to the gradual accumulation of stresses that eventually exceed the capacity of traditional systems to maintain their essential functions. These documents would reveal that the fall of the Byzantine Empire represented not just the end of a specific political entity, but the conclusion of an entire approach to civilization that had assumed traditional institutions could adapt indefinitely to changing circumstances, regardless of how dramatically those circumstances might change. Whether this lesson would be understood by those who survived to establish new political arrangements under Ottoman rule remained uncertain, but the census data would serve as permanent evidence that even the most carefully documented civilizations eventually encounter circumstances where their traditional approaches to survival become irrelevant, regardless of how meticulously they have been maintained through centuries of patient attention to the boring details that had sustained their existence for longer than any contemporary memory could recall.